Hello, I'm Susan Guagliumi, and this is the Studio DL1000 linking machine. In the next hour or so, I'm going to show you a variety of effects that can be achieved with a linker. These include assembling garments, adding decorative surface details, and construction effects that you may have been doing by hand. Let's take a look at the machine up close and determine exactly what does what and how the machine operates. The linking machine is made up of several distinct parts. The drum with a series of point needles that rotates past the assembly mechanism where the linking actually takes place. In this portion of the machine, there's a needle, a hook needle, that's located inside the machine and moves in and out as the drum rotates. The yarn is carried by this little foot that jumps around the needle and forms each individual crochet or chain type stitch. The rest of this portion of the mechanism is strictly for threading to tension the yarn and make sure that it forms the right kind of a stitch. Let's take a closer look at the point needles on the drum and the two scales that are marked above them. There's a gray scale that's marked in increments of 5 that corresponds needle for needle with the knitting machine. In other words, if you had scrapped off 50 stitches when you were working on the knitter, you'd know that by hanging them from needle number 1 to needle number 50 here on the linker, you would be rehanging the same 50 stitches. The gray scale is most useful when you're hanging stitches. The pink scale above it is marked in increments of 5 centimeters, and in fact the individual centimeters are also indicated. This scale is important when you're hanging side seams, side edges of fabric where you don't have an individual stitch count to guide you and you need to do some stretching and changing on the fabric. If you stretch the fabric too much, the side seams won't match. If you don't stretch it enough, the seams would hike up and the sweater or the garment would be shortened. One way you can make sure that you're stretching the fabric enough is to use the knit contour system to tell you where the 10 centimeter mark should be placed. If you look at this piece of contour paper, you'll see that on the left it's indicated at 10 centimeters and at 20 centimeters. And when these lines roll through the knit contour unit, I would hang a yarn tag on the edge of the fabric so that I know exactly where the 10 centimeter marks are. And I can use those marks, those yarn tags, to coordinate with the marks on the drum. So if I've marked the fabric here at 10 centimeters and I begin hanging the edge of the fabric at 1, the first yarn tag on the edge of the garment should coordinate with the 10 centimeter mark here on the machine. Let me caution you that whenever you disengage the drum, you should make sure the hand wheel at the top is set with the dot on the indicator. This will assure you that the needle is all the way inside of the drum and can't be damaged by the point needle assembly. It's also important to make sure when you step on the foot pedal to activate the linking that the head is locked into position. The DL1000 threads as easily as a sewing machine or a knitting machine. You begin by passing the yarn through the upper yarn guide, like this, in front of the next pin, and then between the tension discs. Separate them so that you make sure the yarn is inside the little copper pin at the back, and then pass it through the wire guide at the bottom. A special threader comes with your DL that's got a notch at the end so that you can catch the yarn and feed it through the back of the yarn feeder, like so, to finish threading the unit. You should notice that on this yarn guide, the center point is marked by a small notch. That indicates the point at which the first linked stitch will be formed. So you always want to make sure when you're positioning the fabric with the drum that the first stitch, the first point needle holding a stitch, lines up with that notch, and then bring the fabric presser up against the drum to hold the fabric in position. The linking machine forms a chain stitch, and on one side it looks very much like the knit stitch that's formed by the knitting machine, and on the other side of the fabric it forms what looks like a purl stitch or a back stitch. The thing to remember is that the side of the fabric that's against the drum, that faces away from you, will always form the knit stitch, just as it does on the knitting machine. And the side that faces you will form the back stitch or the purl stitched effect. In most instances, it won't much matter which side of the fabric faces where. A seam is a seam and there isn't generally a right or a wrong side to it. However, there are some of the decorative effects and certain neckband treatments where it's very important to know which side will face where. So keep this in mind as you begin to work with the linking machine. Now, I'm going to put 2 rows of chain stitching on here for you to see, one with the back side facing me and one with the right side facing me. I want to make sure that they're straight, so for the horizontal placement I've knitted 1 row on a stitch size 10. For the vertical placement I've left a needle out of working position so that it would form a ladder. To position the horizontal row on the point needles, use that extra large row of stitches to act as a guide to position the fabric straight. Be very, very difficult to position 1 row evenly across the point needles without some kind of a marker. If not a row on stitch size 10, you might try using a row of weaving technique to give you a guide to follow. Once you've positioned the fabric, with very little stretching please, rotate the drum to position the first stitch at the center of the yarn guide and then set the drum in place. Push the fabric presser up against the fabric, making sure that you keep the yarn right in the notch at the center. And then step on the foot pedal to begin the linking. Now I'm going to link slower than I normally would so that you can see some of the activity as the yarn feeder whips around that needle. There. Puts yarn into the hook of the needle. This is a more common speed. Too fast or too slow can be a problem, so keep that speed in mind. I'm also going to link a little bit beyond the end of the fabric so that I've got something that I can ravel back to. Put the hand wheel so that the dot is on the arrow. And then to end the linking, but to keep the unit threaded, what I'm going to do is hold this end of the yarn back here so that the yarn feeder won't be able to operate. And I'm going to hold this end off to the side also so that as I use the hand wheel to bring the needle forward, watch what happens. No yarn is supplied by the yarn feeder. The needle is going to go back, and as it goes back, the stitch is going to be popped right off. Make sure the needle is all the way back in, line up the dot with the arrow again. Release the drum and then bring the fabric around where you can check to make sure that each stitch is perfect. Then just pop the fabric up off of the point needles. Now I purposely linked beyond the edge of the fabric so that I could ravel back and end the chain stitching right at the edge of the fabric. Just pull on the free end of the yarn and unravel the stitches one by one until there's just 1 stitch left at the edge of the fabric, and then pull the chain back through itself to lock it off. Like so. I'm going to clip off these tails just so they're not in the way for the next step. In order to produce a row of chain stitching in this vertical space, I need to position the fabric now with the knit side against the drum, and the purl side will face me. Whenever you hang vertical spaces, make sure you stretch the fabric slightly so that it will account for the difference in the stitch that's formed. Otherwise, seams and decorative effects will tend to be somewhat shortened. Because the back side of the fabric won't be important, I'm going to get rid of this yarn tail right at the beginning so I don't need to finish it off later on. And I'm just going to weave the end backwards through the points, like so. Ease out some of the extra slack and then begin linking. And this will give me a finished end that I won't need to deal with later. There's an alternative method for ending the linking that's excellent for swatches, but of very limited value for garments because it leaves a short stubby tail, but it is fast. First of all, make sure that the dot is definitely lined up with the arrow so that the needle is safely inside. Release the drum and rotate it back towards you until you feel some resistance, and then give a sharp jerk to the right. That will break the yarn. Now I've just completed the first row of chaining to create one of the vertical effects like I've got in this plaid fabric. Plaids are created by knitting horizontal stripes and then adding the vertical detail with rows of chaining. The chaining is placed in ladders that were created by leaving needles in non-working position while you knit. The three verticals in the middle were created on single ladders, that is one needle in non-working position, and the wider verticals on either side were created by leaving two needles out of work to create a much wider ladder. Now I've already placed one row of chaining into a wide ladder, and I'd like to put a second row into the same ladder. So what I'm going to do first is pull against the knitting to squeeze the first row of chaining as close to the edges of the ladder as possible, and then just drop the fabric back down, line it up and put it into position for the second row of chaining. If the head doesn't lock in right away when you try to move this knob over to set, give a little bit of a jiggle until you feel it catch. If you start linking before that really does catch, then you'll probably jam up the yarn at the beginning of the linking. There, that'll give you the wide vertical space, and you can see the ladders for the single chains that have been left here. The character of the fabric is changed radically by the addition of the vertical chaining from a horizontal stripe right into a plaid. Horizontal chaining can also be produced in single or paired rows, and in fact here across the center of this swatch I've got 4 rows of horizontal chaining that was placed in 2 rows of size 10 stitches to keep them parallel. But there are some other interesting variations that you can create by using a little bit more imagination. This edging on the bottom creates a ruffled edge because of the kind of cast-on that was used and the way the edge loops were hung onto the point needles. Fabric was cast on the knitting machine with an every other needle cast on, which leaves large loops and free yarn between each of the stitches. Well, each of those loops is hung on a point needle with a skipped point needle in between. So you've got extra space that will form an additional chain stitch in between and cause the fabric to ruffle as it's linked. The cast on is important here because it feeds extra slack into every one of these stitches, and you couldn't do it with an unstretchy or an ungiving cast on edge. Any extra slack can be adjusted out later, and the amount of ruffling can be controlled by just pulling on this tail end of the yarn. Get these couple of others on here and then we'll link it right off. Okay, now the edge will tend to curl up a bit until it's been steamed and finished. But as I said before, I can control how much give there is in the edge by pulling, there it is, on the blue yarn tail, and either gather the edge in closer or allow it to stay ruffled out totally. I could gather the whole edge in fact, and use this as some sort of a casing for a gathered edge, or allow the stitches to spread out a little bit more freely. The same kind of a cast-on was used at this end of the fabric, except that it wasn't gathered in and a stitch was hung on every single point needle. So the fabric was hung stitch for point, one on one. One on each, and then chained off This one hung with the right side of the fabric against the drum, and then a second row put below it. It's exactly the same as multiple rows of chaining is used down here. This row is a very raised ridge, and it's a very, very different effect from the rest of the chaining, and that's the one that I'll show you. I'm going to mount the size 10 row right against the drum with the knit side against the drum. And put in one row of linking. When that row is complete, take the fabric off, turn it over, and hang the edge. Fold the fabric back if that'll help. Hang the edge of that chain right on the point needles. Now with larger stitches, you can sometimes just slip it right over. I find that I need to use a pick or a transfer tool to help lift those stitches up onto the point needles. But you're going to hang one for one and skipping only if it's necessary to keep from straining the fabric, as it may be. Maybe after every 5 I'll skip one stitch here in the chain and then go to the next one to hang that up on the point needles. If it feels very tight hanging the whole stitch, just pick up half of the stitch, and it won't really matter whether it's the front half or the back halves as long as you're consistent about it. Hang all of those onto the point needles and then run another row of linking, and that'll create the raised edges that would be nice for dividing sections of a garment or adding some raised details. Before we begin constructing shoulder seams and side seams and all the raglans and variation seams that we can do on a linker, let me just bring out a few points about the swatches themselves and how they should be prepared. It's important that any fabric you bring to the linking machine be finished as much as possible. That is, it should be blocked or steamed so that the scrap knitting doesn't curl over and so that the stitches have had a chance to settle into their positions. It's also important that any ends you possibly can are finished off. We don't want to have a lot of strings hanging from a piece of knitting that are going to catch in the point needles or get caught up where they need not be. Also, it's important that whenever you're using waste yarn to remove live stitches from the machine, you use a yarn that has good contrast so that you don't become confused as to which stitches are the main stitches and which stitches are the waste yarn stitches. You can also make it easier if you knit the last row of the main knitting with a stitch size larger. Those stitches will accept the point needles a little bit more easily. Now there's a whole variety of seams that we can construct on a linking machine. Probably the most common is a shoulder seam. Most people do this kind of a seam by removing the shoulder stitches from the knitting machine on scrap yarn and then assembling the two shoulders together. In order to do that, it means that you're going to be hanging one piece of the fabric with the right side facing you and the other one with the wrong side facing you. So this is a good time to bring up the difference between hanging both sides of the fabric, and there is a major difference here. The purl side of the fabric is easier to see the stitches on. If we let the red be the main knitting and the blue be the waste yarn, it's pretty easy to see that the little half moon shape right along this edge represents the top of the last row of stitches in the main knitting. So when you hang this piece of fabric on the point needles, there should be a point needle extending below each of these half moon shapes, right through the stitch below, and that will catch each of the live stitches. But when you're hanging the other piece of fabric and you have the right side of the fabric facing you, it's much more difficult to see the stitches. And this is where most novices run into trouble on a linking machine. So see if this helps you. Each of the stitches forms a V shape. And if you could see behind the fabric, you'd see that the little orange half moon runs right behind here, completing that shape, making a closed shape, so that when you hang the V's on each point needle, and then later remove the waist knitting, each of the stitches will have been caught. On the other hand, if you had hung the upside down V shape that's formed here, when the waist knitting is removed, there's nothing to hold that shape and the seam will come apart. So it's very, very important that in 99% of the cases, because there is an exception we'll come to, that you hang the V shapes rather than the upside down V shapes. This is one of the reasons that we never remove waist knitting until we've taken the piece off the machine and checked the stitches for accuracy. If you ever have to rehang a piece of knitting on the linking machine, as long as the waist knitting is intact, you can do so. If you're in a hurry to remove the waist, you'll end up with a fabric that cannot be rehung. Now, even when you're working with the side edges of the fabric, such as the armhole edge of a drop-shouldered sweater or the side seams of a skirt, for example, there's an easier and a more difficult side to hang as well. And in this case, it's the right side of the fabric that's easier to see. There's a much stronger vertical line that you can follow to get the fabric on straight. And the purl side is the one that tends to be a little bit more confusing for people to see. I'm not sure that that shows up as clearly here, but this line becomes a very strong one where the sides of the stitches connect. It's very, very easy to get the fabric on straight. But on the purl side of the fabric, you get a little bit of roll to the edge, and this line is a little more ambiguous to follow. So if you do have difficulties, you can certainly leave a ladder in the fabric. Do that by leaving a needle in non-working position after transferring the stitch onto an adjacent needle. Or on the right side of the fabric, you could use a piece of ravel cord and run a row of hand basting right through here, so that when you turn the fabric over, you can follow that line of stitching. It's what sewers call stitch in the ditch, but it acts as a good marker to use on the back of the fabric. Just use ravel cord or something that will remove easily. Now, when you're working with a shoulder seam for a standard gauge fabric, you're going to hang the first piece of the fabric with the right side facing you, and the second piece with the wrong side facing you. The waist knitting will extend above and remain in place until after the seam has been checked. To hang the same kind of a seam with a chunky fabric, you need to make a concession for the differences in the gauges of the machine and the linker. The gauge of a standard gauge machine is pretty close to the gauge on the linking machine. There isn't a lot of discrepancy, and the fabrics will usually mount stitch for stitch, point for point. But when you've brought a fabric from the chunky machine, you're going to have extra space that needs to be accounted for. So in this case, although we'll be hanging the right side and then the wrong side, again with the waist yarn extending above the points, what you'll need to do is skip points when you hang the fabric. So you might hang one stitch, skip a point, hang the next stitch. You might instead decide to bring 2 points through the same stitch. You might hang one, skip two, whatever is going to allow you to hang the fabric over the proper width without either stretching or compressing the width. Same thing with the side seams. You'll need to do some stretching to make these side edges fit. We don't have an exact number of stitches that tells us how wide the fabric should be. So instead, what I need to do is introduce a little bit of stretch so that the linked stitch doesn't compress the fabric. For short seams, something maybe like a sleeve, I wouldn't worry too much about it, and I can usually guesstimate exactly how much stretch I need. But if I was doing a gored skirt with 6 seams, I want all 6 of them to be exact. And in that case, I would tag the edges, as I mentioned earlier, and use the pink scale to help me. Another chunky fabric. In this case, they're both a different color, but I've used, sort of a blended yarn in between that wouldn't show on either of them. And that yarn, incidentally, was of about this weight. The chunky yarn would never, ever be used for the linking process. Raglan seams are possible. Just be very careful that you don't introduce extra stretch, because if you do, the seam will buckle from the stretch. And of course, drop-shouldered seams, which are a combination of open stitches to side edges. This particular one has some extra embellishment in the seam, and I'll show you how all of this is done. To begin a shoulder seam, hang the first piece with the right side facing you and place 1 stitch on each of the point needles, making sure that the stitch is coming through the V rather than the upside down V between the stitches. Then hang the second piece with the wrong side facing you over the same point needles, making sure this time that each point needle comes out underneath one of the half moon shapes that marks the first row of the main knitting, where it adjoins the waist knitting. and then link. Chunky shoulder seams are constructed the same way, except that you need to leave an empty prong in between each stitch, so that in effect what you're doing is hanging a stitch and then skipping a prong, working on every other prong all the way across the fabric. Very heavy fabrics, you may even want to skip 2 prongs in between, although that's a little more unusual. The second piece is hung with the wrong side facing you, and again skipping every other prong. It's a little trickier sometimes when you have the back side because there seems to be more in the way. If the prong that you're skipping pierces the scrap yarn, that won't really matter. You may end up with some scrap knitting caught in the chain. You can pick that out afterwards with a tweezer if that happens. And then using a lighter weight yarn, you'll simply link. Side seams are easier to hang than shoulder seams because it isn't quite so crucial when you're not dealing with live stitches. Hopefully you'll end up with a nearly invisible seam if you do it right. Hang the first piece with the right side facing you and about 1 stitch in from the edge of the fabric. It's easier to see the stitches on the right side of the fabric because the stitches themselves create a strong vertical line that you can follow when it's turned on its side. Now with a seam like this, you don't need to worry too much about the stretching because it's such a small piece, but if this were the seam of an actual sweater, you'd have to pay much more attention to the pink scale to know how much stretch to introduce into the fabric. The purl side is a little bit trickier to hang because you haven't got a nice vertical line to follow, so you have to hope that you're working 1 stitch in from the edge and no more. With very, very fine fabrics, you can leave a needle out of work when you knit the fabric itself, usually the second needle from the edge, so that it creates a fine ladder, and you can use that ladder to help you hang the fabric straight. You can also do what's called stitch in the ditch and run a row of basting from the right side with a piece of ravel cord, so that when you look at it from the back, you have the ravel cord to act as a guide, and then you can remove the ravel cord before you do the actual linking. Chunky side seams are hung in exactly the same way. You need to make sure, of course, that you're using a lighter weight yarn to do the actual linking, one that will blend with both colors in this case. Hang the first piece with the right side facing you and make sure you stretch the fabric out. You may have 2 points coming out of this stitch and 1 out of the next, 2 out of the next, 2, 1, whatever seems to spread the fabric out over the width that you require. Remember, you can use the pink centimeter scale to help you get the fabric out to size accurately without introducing too much or too little stretch. The heavier the fabrics are, the easier it is actually to hang with the wrong side facing you because you can so clearly see where that 1 stitch from the edge is located. You can also assemble raglan seams on the linking machine as long as you make sure that you make all of your decreases in the full fashion method so that you have a nice straight line to follow. Then the fabric is easier to hang without introducing extra stretch. Hang the first piece just like the straight side seams. The right side facing you, 1 stitch from the edge, and you've got a nice line to follow because of that full fashion shaping. The second piece will be hung with the wrong side facing, and again 1 stitch from the edge. It's no different than hanging a straight seam, except you have to be very, very careful not to introduce extra stretch or to shorten the raglan seam. Last but not least, we have the kind of combination seam that you find in a drop-shouldered sweater, where you're working with the side edges of the armhole edge of the garment piece itself and the live stitches at the top of the sleeve piece. The two have been joined in this case with a cord in between just to embellish the seam. Begin by hanging the armhole edge of the garment with the right side facing you, working again one stitch in from the edge of the fabric. Now normally I would just hang the live stitches of the sleeve right on top of that, but because I'm going to add some decorative effect here, I'll do that next so that it's sandwiched between the two pieces of fabric. And I'm just going to push on this cord. It's your typical 3-stitch cord that you knit by allowing the carriage to knit in one direction and slip in the other. All of our machines are able to do this. The second piece of the garment is hung with the wrong side facing you, so that you're hanging the easy side both ways. The easy side on this piece with the right side facing you, and the easy side here with the wrong side and the little half moon shapes facing you. When you've got both pieces hung with the band in between, push the fabric as far back on the point needles as it will go. This is even more important because of the additional layer we've introduced between the two. And then link. There are many different kinds of neck bands and a number of ways that you can join them to the garments that you knit. Probably the simplest one to understand is just a piece of rib that ends with some stockinette and is then joined either to live stitches on the garment neckline or even to a bound-off edge. Make sure when you knit this kind of a rib band that you transfer all of the stitches to one bed and then with the scrap yarn only knit a number of rows across all of the needles so that you have some stockinette to deal with as your waste yarn. This kind of a band looks very much like the bands you've been accustomed to doing right on the bed of the machine, where the neck band joins the garment with a very definitely seamed effect. The rest of the bands that I'll be showing you are bands that are called sandwich bands because they fold over and enclose the raw or the finished edge of a garment section. This kind of a neck band, a sandwich band, is the ideal solution to cut and sew construction problems because the raw edges are covered. My favorite sandwich band is nothing more than a flap of stockinette that's begun and ended with scrap knitting and then is attached so that it encloses the raw edge of the garment. Finished stockinette bands like this one can be used for necklines, for sleeves where you don't want ribbing, or even for the bottom of a jacket where you don't want the rib to narrow the shape of the jacket. I can knit the exact same kind of a band with a picot edge simply by stopping halfway through the knitting of the band and making a row of eyelets. The flat band looks like this, and then when it encloses the edge it folds and creates a row of picots. You can also attach a sandwich band to the side edge of a fabric rather than the open stitches, and in that case you may as well include some buttonholes to create a cardigan band. In this case the buttonholes were knitted right in as part of the band structure. Instead of a plain stockinette band, you might try knitting the band with some Fair Isle detail, and in this case I've also added a row of garter stitch to create a stronger ridge when the band folds in half. If you don't have a ribber but you want a ribbed effect anyhow, you might consider knitting the band as mock rib and then mounting it as a flat sandwich band application. When you knit the band itself, begin with about 4 rows knitting over all the needles and then transfer every third stitch to the adjacent needle and put the empty needles into non-working position. Knit as many rows as you need for the depth of the band, reducing your stitch size as you go. Then knit 1 row on size 10 and knit the inside of the band, increasing your stitch size until you've completed the same number of rows. If you begin and end a rib band with some stockinette, you can fold the rib over to double its bulk and enclose the edge of the sweater, as I've done here on this sample and on this lightweight alpaca sweater. The double band gives much more body to a neck that might not have enough body on its own. One of the most popular bands of all is the double bed sandwich band. It usually begins with a number of rows of ribbing and then splits into 2 layers of stockinette that are used to enclose the garment neckline. It might be attached to a knitted fabric or even to a woven fabric, as I've done here. If you extend the length of the ribbing, then it becomes a collar band like this. It's a very shallow English rib collar. Got the sandwich band mounting and then so many rows of ribbing. Or by extending the band even further, it becomes a much, much deeper polo type collar. You can see we've got here. This kind of a collar is really only feasible to attach on a linking machine because you need to assemble both shoulder seams and then attach the band so that the ends meet at the center of the neckline. Because the linking machine is a round drum type linker, the whole sweater can be placed right over the form and the neckline worked around so that the edges match. And last but not least, we've got a combination band with a long rib section that's mounted to the neckline first and a rib sandwich band in front of it so that the rib section folds over and becomes a collar that's supported by the rib band. In practice, it looks like this. All sandwich bands are hung in basically the same way. One edge of the band is hung onto the point needles, and then the neckline or the garment edge is hung on top of that. This is one of the instances where it really does matter whether you have the right or the wrong side of the fabric facing you. For most sandwich band applications, the effect that we want to see on the outside of the garment is the back stitch or the purled effect. On the other side of the fabric, the knit stitch effect is too strong and it would distract from the outside of the sweater. So, we're going to hang the neck edge with the right side of the fabric facing us along the same point needles as one edge of the band. Now, the edge that you hang inside of a sandwich band has got to be either a cast-on, bound off, or otherwise secured edge. You would never hang live stitches on waste yarn inside of the neckline because chances are pretty good that where the fabric is pushed over the points, one of the points would be coming through an upside down V instead of a V. In other words, the stitch wouldn't be caught. And if you pulled on the sweater, even as far as pulling it over your head, the stitches could undo and run down. Probably some of you have had this happen with commercial sweaters that you've purchased. It's a much cheaper way of doing it, and it isn't worth it when you're doing your own sweaters. Once you've got this edge hung, we'll fold this neckband down over it, and that will cover the raw edge. Now, you should be able to feel the edge of the garment inside the band. So you want to make sure that you've got enough of the band extending that it will fill up the space inside the band. It would be like having a sandwich with no meat inside. We want to make sure there's a little bit of meat inside the sandwich. So figure generally about 1/4 of an inch of the neckline should extend into the band. You'd never hang just on the very edge stitches because the band would flop around, and by the same token you wouldn't want several inches bunched up inside of the band or it wouldn't lie flat. When you turn the band down like so to hang the other edge, this is one of those times that I mentioned earlier when you would be hanging the upside down V's. The fabric is upside down, so the V's are upside down. And you're going to have several thicknesses of fabric to hang here, and you'll have to really concentrate on keeping it back on the point needles or you'll keep hanging the same stitches over and over. If you can keep a little bit of tension on the fabric, keep working it back. Those point needles should just about pop through in the right places every time. Avoid tugging on the fabric any more than you need to. All the waste yarn is intact here and on the back layer. Bring it into position and link. Once you've checked both sides of the fabric to see if you've missed any stitches, then you can pull out the waste yarn. And you've got a beautifully finished edge totally enclosed. The purl stitch on the right side of the fabric is the norm. It doesn't mean that if it works with your design that you couldn't do it the other way around. Just make sure you're in control so you know when you hang the fabric on the machine whether you're going to get the purl stitch or the knit stitch on the right side of the fabric. The picot band, the Fair Isle band, the buttonhole band, and the mock rib are all variations on a basic stockinette band. Let's take a look at the way the bands would be mounted on the machine, and I think you'll see that they're all the same thing. The picot band would be mounted, and I'm not going stitch for stitch here, I'm just spreading it out to give you the idea. The picot band would be mounted with the waste yarn pointed down, the fabric would be hung, and then the top edge of the band would be folded over. You'll always have one easy edge to hang and then one difficult. In this case, the easy edge is this one, where you can see the purl side of the fabric and see each of the stitches clearly. The difficult edge is when you fold down over. Remember, when you fold the fabric over, the stitches are upside down, and in this case you're looking for the upside down V's rather than the V's that you would normally hang on the knit side of the fabric. The buttonhole band, when you open it up and look at the inside, it's exactly like a stockinette band. The lower edge or one edge gets mounted on the points, the fabric is hung between, and then the top edge of the band folds over. It doesn't affect the actual mounting of the fabric or the band, the fact that there are buttonholes in the band. The Fair Isle band is a little bit different because there's a definite right and wrong side to the fabric. I want to make sure that this row of tulips faces the outside of the sweater. So if I were to mount it this way, I wouldn't have that happening. So I must make sure that the plain side is mounted first, and again it would be stitch by stitch. The fabric would be hung, and then the band would fold down over it. I say that this is the right side facing me because I'm assuming that you're going to mount the fabric with the right side facing so that you get the back stitched effect on the outside of the sweater. The same consideration is important with the mock rib band because where the needles were put back into working position, there's a larger opening or a hole that's been left. That has to be on the inside of the garment, which means that that edge is hung first, the fabric is mounted, and then the band is folded over. You always want to make sure that the better edge of the band is the last one that folds towards you and encloses the neckline of the garment, because that's going to be the outside of the garment. I've hung one edge of this band on the needles and then the serged out neckline edge of the jacquard fabric on top of it. Now I'm folding over the edge of the band to complete the neckline. With a rib band like this that ends with many rows of stockinette, rather than folding the scrap yarn down and having to work through knit and purl stitches alternately, you might find it easier to fold the waste yarn back away from you and then just pop the edges of the stitches over the needles. It's a little bit different way of dealing with the waste yarn, but it might be a little less confusing to see the stitches. Let me fold this back a bit more there. Keep your finger over the stitches once you've got them on because you're working so close to the points, or the tips of the point needles, that the stitches will easily slide off and you'll end up rehanging them all. Most ribbed bands end with several rows of circular stockinette in the main yarn, and then several rows of circular stockinette in the waste yarn, and some full needle rib to hold it all together till you get it to the machine. So I'm going to pull out the rib that's holding it together, and you can see with this last row that it separates into two layers of stockinette. That's what I need to hang the fabric on the machine. Trim away some of this excess. And I'm going to hang one edge of the band, and it's interesting when you look at this, it looks like a stockinette band. It isn't until you flip it up and see that there's rib attached that it's any different at all. I'm going to attach the lower edge, stitch by stitch. Almost there. one edge of the band is hung, I'll hang the neckline edge of the garment. And as I said, in this case, I'm hanging a piece of Pendleton wool with what I perceive as the right side facing me. In this case, I don't need to do anything special to finish the neckline edge because it's a closely woven wool. If it were a more crudely woven, hand-woven type fabric, for example, I very well might run some stitching. Let's get that on there straight. I very well might run some stitching or serging to secure the fabric so that it didn't ravel or fray. Allow about 1/4 of an inch of the fabric to extend inside the band. Push it all the way back on the points. And then just for novelty's sake, I'm going to jazz this band up a little bit more by adding some white lace to the same point needles. I probably wouldn't add white lace to a Pendleton wool, but I want you to see how nicely this attaches with a rib band. When I've got my neckline and or lace additions mounted on the point needles, then the top edge of the band will fold down over and close the sandwich. And again, this is the upside down edge of the fabric, so the V's will be upside down. If you can't get that first stitch, as I'm struggling with this one, skip it. Get all of the others on and then come back to it afterwards. It's a lot easier when the rest of the fabric has been secured. And I can assure you that all of this is easier when you're not trying to keep your hands clear for a camera or an audience to see what you're doing. If you go slowly, you should be able to keep track of the stitches and whether or not you've caught every one of them. But when you're done, I'd still recommend kind of tugging against the fabric and making sure that everything looks the same. Chances are pretty good that if you've made a mistake, it'll stand out and you'll see something that's different from the rest of the stitches. It may just be some scrap yarn that's caught, as mine is here, or it could be a stitch that you've split all together and grabbed the wrong portion of it. So you're grabbing upside down V's and V's when they should be each other. Scrap yarn, there we go. Okay, I'll move this over, set the drum, and link. I'm going through 4 layers of fabric right now. 2 layers of the band, the wool fabric, and the lace. There, let's lock off the chain so it doesn't unravel itself. Oops. And remove the waste yarn and take a look at the joining. There you have it, a beautiful edge, flat sandwich band mount through the lace and the wool fabric. When the rib is knitted softer and extends longer, instead of just forming a rib neckband, it becomes a collar, like the one I've got in my hand. When you look at it, you can see that it's nothing but a rib sandwich band. Here are the rows of circular stockinette that enclose the fabric, and the rib tends to fan or flare out to form the collar. Most collars of this type are knitted in 2 sections that meet at the center front and the center back of the sweater. So that implies that both of the shoulder seams would need to be assembled before you could apply the neckband or the collar in this case. That means that this is a treatment that was really only practical on a linking machine. When you look at each of the collar sections, they look exactly like the plain rib band, except for the flare in the rib. This particular collar was knitted in an English rib so that it's very soft and flares out to give it a softer shape. If you pull out the few rows of close rib, you see that this band also separates into 2 layers of stockinette, exactly like the flat stockinette sandwich bands or the rib band that we just applied to the woolen fabric. Fabric would be applied here, and then the band would close down over and give you your collar attachment. Now there's another collar attachment we can use that helps the collar stand up higher and have a little bit more life. It's a two-part joining that requires using a ribbed sandwich band in conjunction with a separate ribbed collar. And if you take a look at this, you can pretty much determine what the order is that the fabrics would need to be hung on the machine. Clearly, the piece furthest away from me is this piece of ribbing, and then the band would be hung just as it was for all of the others. So in other words, I'd be hanging this piece of rib stitch for stitch, which I'm not doing here, and then I would pull out the scrap to get this band ready to go, just back enough to separate into two layers for me. The lower edge of the band would be hung here, the neckline of the fabric with the right side facing me, and then the top edge of the band folds down over, and the whole thing is linked. I've got 4 layers of fabric here, which makes this very, very thick, and it can often be difficult to keep it back on the needles. So one of the things that I find that helps when I'm doing something like this is to use a very large head common pin. A quilter's pin will do. And use it to bind the layers of the fabric together by catching the pin through the fabric in between the point needles. You're not really pinning to any part of the machine, you're pinning the fabric to itself, but it will keep all of these layers from separating and riding forward. The only thing you must do is be sure to remove them as you get over into this area. As soon as you have the fabric secured under the fabric presser, you remove all of the pins and let your fingers hold them on. You're going to ruin the machine if you allow it to link through with these in place, but they can be a great help when you're trying to get the fabric hung and it's riding forward on the points. You may also find with these kinds of fabrics, if you've got enough scrap yarn to hang them from here, that the claw weights are useful, or even some clothespins, some spring-type clothespins to keep the fabric layers together. This is a thick fabric, so go slowly with it. There are a number of construction details that are so much easier and so much better when they're done on a linking machine that you'll begin to wonder how you ever got along without one. One of my favorites is zipper installation. You can get a zipper into a sweater so that it lies absolutely flat without any buckling. And the only trick is to make sure that you buy the right kind of a zipper to begin with. Don't rely on cotton twill tape zippers. They haven't got enough stretch, and when the zipper is installed, the fabric will have a tendency to buckle, like so. If you use a zipper that specifies for knits, lightweight zipper for knits, or in this case this Bulon zipper by YKK indicates polyester knit zipper, you should be all right. The zipper tape has just enough stretch to allow for the easing that has to go on when we hang this on the machine. Don't be put off by the amount of force you have to use to press this back over the points. You're not going to damage the machine as long as you're careful and you pay attention to what I'm going to show you. First of all, let's get rid of the zipper tag and the staple that comes to hold it in. And I'm going to press the zipper tape back over the point needles very deliberately and very firmly. There's usually some kind of a stripe or a difference in the weave of the zipper tape that you can use as a guide. I'm going to get it reasonably far back. I'm kind of stretching forward as I do it. And when I've gotten far enough along, I'm going to use the side of this pick to push this fabric all the way back onto the point needles, as far back as it'll go, and I'll come back and tighten all of these up afterwards. Still pushing and pulling, stretching out this tape. Now you wouldn't be able to stretch even this much with a cotton twill tape zipper, and that's where most of the problems begin. But the fabric also hasn't got the same kind of ease to allow the hook needle to pass through. We'll push this back so we don't have to rehang the same section. We're almost done. If you're having trouble stretching, by the way, one thing that will help is to lock the drum so that you can pull against it instead of having to stabilize the drum at the same time. That makes it a lot easier. Okay, and you will have to push. This isn't just a simple mount like a piece of knit fabric is. Okay, now that all of the zipper tape is on, let's get it all back. Use something that's narrow enough to fit between the point needles so that you're not damaging them. This is a very skinny pick tip that I'm using here, just because I don't want to ruin my fingernails pushing back on this tight tape. And it is tight, make no mistake about it. Okay, the worst of it's over. Now I'm going to hang the edge of the sweater over the same point needles. In the sample that I showed you here, when I knitted the fabric, I left the second needle from the edge out of work so that it created a ladder, and it made it a little bit easier to hang the fabric. But I think that that edge stitch looks just a little bit looser than I'd like it. So the sample that I've got here has no ladder to follow. I'm simply going to hang the fabric one stitch in from the edge, and we'll see whether or not it makes any great difference. I'm going to set the head, the fabric presser up against the fabric, and link. You may hear a difference in the way the hook needle sounds going through the fabric. Listen carefully. I'll usually keep my fingers up above to keep the fabric from pulling forward. And I don't link quite so fast. You hear a little bit of a chug. Sometimes you don't hear any difference. It really depends on the zipper and how much it's been spread out. And how tightly you're linking probably has something to do with it. Okay. Take it right off the fabric. I'd lock in the end of the chain, but I'm going to ravel it back. You always work towards the edge. A little bit extra, ravel it back, and then you can secure and hide the edge so that you don't end up having to start right on the mark. You see, I think this is a better mount without the ladder along the side. The ladder added too much ease in this case so that the edge stitch became sloppy. This is probably too large a stitch to allow the ladder. That would only be effective with a much finer knit. So in this case, I'd say don't add the ladder alongside the zipper. It'll make it look a little bit sloppier along the edge. Okay. Now to complete the zipper installation, I would hang the second side of the zipper tape here, and the fabric would extend below it. And I do the exact same kind of a linking. And when the fabric is finished and steamed, it'll be absolutely perfect. If you thread the linker with elastic thread instead of with yarn, you'll find that you can create all kinds of gathered and shirred effects, smocked effects if you will, as long as you're working with lightweight and dress type yarns. This isn't something that will work particularly well on a heavy wool fabric, so reserve the elastic technique for the lightweight yarns. I've threaded the unit exactly as I would have with yarn, except I am using a cotton covered elastic. Usually I'd work with one that matched the color of the fabric, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to see what I'm doing a little more clearly. And the biggest change, I'm going to crank my tension all the way up to 7. The elastic has to feed into the fabric under very tight tension so that when I take the fabric off the machine it tries to relax, and that's what creates the gathered effect. The more rows of elastic you put in, the greater the gathered effect will be. And in order to get those rows in straight, I'd recommend knitting some rows much larger size. Fabric was knitted on a 6, the enlarged rows were knitted on a size 10 to give me a guide to work from. I'm going to hang it on the point needles the same way that I normally would, except that for the shirring I'm going to stretch the fabric sideways a bit more than usual. Now for this first row, I've got the knit side of the fabric facing me, the right side of the garment, and because it's facing me, I'm going to get the back stitch or the purled effect there. Let's see what that looks like and then compare it to the opposite face. Listen, you'll be able to hear the elastic making a little ping noise. When you're working with elastic, don't chain too far beyond the edge of the fabric because it does tend to knot up on the empty point needles. It works much more efficiently when there's fabric on the needles. So let's clip the yarn. And in fact, I'd be tempted to unthread it, get it out of the way. Get the last stitch off the needle. Bring it around and lock the chain immediately because the elastic will really let go quite quickly. Alright, that's one row with the knit side facing. Let's do the row directly below it with the purl side of the fabric facing. Hopefully you'll be able to see the difference. Okay, let's lock off the end of the chain before it undoes itself. And then take a look at the knit side of the fabric. I think you'll be able to see that there are two very different effects here. The top row of the gathering was done with the right side of the fabric facing me so that it received the back stitched effect. The second row of the chaining was done with the right side against the drum of the machine so that it has the chain stitched effect. Now, which one you choose is up to you. If you want the shearing to be as invisible as possible, you're going to use a matching elastic thread, and you're probably going to work with the right side of the work facing you so that it gets the back stitched effect. If, however, you want the chain stitched effect to be very strong, maybe it's going to be part of an embroidery design, then you're going to put this side of the fabric against the drum so that you get the chain stitched effect. It's up to you. They're both right. There are two very interesting construction methods that you can apply to tailored suits. Both of them have to do with the installation of the sleeve head into the garment body. The one that I'm holding here involves knitting a flange that will cover the raw edges of some nylon netting. The netting serves the purpose of raising the sleeve head away from the garment body so that it's a crisper, sharper look. It's not really a shoulder pad, and it certainly isn't a ruffle underneath the sleeve cap. It's just a little bit of support, as is the flange that lies under the garment body. The seam itself has a very crisp, sharp look to it. And in order to do this, you have to specifically knit your sleeve head so that you have the flange to work with. Let me show you exactly how you do this kind of a sleeve cap. First of all, when you knit the sleeve, you have to allow for the flange. So at the point where you would normally bound off the shaped sleeve cap, instead put in a marker row, just weave a piece of ravel cord over and under some of the needles to show you exactly where the sleeve cap would have ended. And then knit about an inch, inch and a half straight up and take it off the machine on scrap yarn. This extra inch or so is going to provide the flange for you. Now, hang the sleeve edge or the armhole edge of the garment pieces onto the machine. You would have already sewed your shoulder seam, so this will be one continuous seam from front to back on the garment pieces. Right side facing, all the way back on the point needles. Then with the wrong side facing, push the top of the sleeve cap, right where the marker row of weaving is located, onto the same needles, and continue pushing the rest of the sleeve shape onto the needles as well. Okay, the flange extends above. I'm going to use some nylon mesh and more or less pleat it onto the same point needles all the way across, letting it extend about halfway into the flange, so that I create some padding up there as well. The excess at the bottom can always be trimmed off, so don't worry about that now. It's easier to handle a bigger piece than it is a little scrap. And I'm going to trim off this extra. Push this back on the needles and then fold the flange down over and hang these stitches on the same needles. Now, because the fabric is upside down, the V's should be upside down as well. Remember that as you poke the point needles right through. Stop and check yourself periodically. Am I still hanging the upside down V's, or has it switched? Now this is going to have a tendency to poke forward, and this is a good example of a fabric where I always end up using these big pins to hold it in place. I'll take it out before I start linking, but it's better than a third hand right now. Where are those upside down V's? There they are. Okie doke. Now, before I link this fabric, there's one more thing I want to do. This particular sample is a fabric that's 70% wool, 30% rayon, and that tends to be a very staticky fabric to begin with. But the studio is very dry right now, and I've been doing a lot of linking, so to avoid there being any static electricity, I'm going to rely on just a quick spritzing of some static guard around the outside of the cone and the area around the machine. I don't know that it's going to prevent all of the static, but it can't hurt. Now, I'll position the fabric so that the first stitch here at the beginning of the sleeve is right up under the assembly, and I will also, as I said before, pull out the pins before they get a chance to get too close to any of the activity. Looks good. Lock off the chain. Pull out this scrap. And then, depending how much flounce I want in the top of the sleeve, I'm going to trim out some of the nylon because there's no way you'd ever need quite this much support in the top of a sleeve. For a very puffy style sleeve, I might trim it back only this far. But for a tailored suit, chances are pretty good I'm only going to leave about an inch of the nylon extending, just enough to support the sleeve cap, so that when I look at it from the outside, it gives me the extra crispness that I'm looking for. Now the second variation, or the second method for installing sleeve caps is very, very similar, but with one minor difference. This sleeve cap, instead of just allowing for a flange, allows for a small shoulder pad to be knitted right in. Fabric looks like this. It's been knitted with short row shaping, the same as you would knit a stocking toe or heel. At the top of the sleeve there's been a marker row woven in to show where I would normally have bound off and what marks the top of the sleeve cap. And then, using holding position, short row shaping, I've shaped a large triangle and then worked it back out and ended with the scrap yarn. This is the area that will be stuffed for a shoulder pad. Let me show you what that looks like. It's just about the exact same mount with a minor difference. I'm going to hang the garment armhole edge across the needles. Push it all the way back, and then I'm going to hang the sleeve cap again, pressing it on right over the marker row that shows the top of the original sleeve cap, and then continue hanging the